Just by way of brief introduction to our session, we are living in times of unprecedented change, and the world around us is a very different place. Organisations have been reacting both to the pandemic and over the last 18 months. Very often that's been with a short-term focus to keep operations going, and in some cases ensure they could continue and exist. As a secondary step, many have been and continue to develop operations to be more resilient and adapting their organisations to be more flexible and agile as the world changes. A key step now is to ensure that these resilience activities and improvements are embedded and changes made are sustainable and help to realise what they've been set out to achieve. So our agenda today is covering three main areas: the value of delivering successful change, building resilience into your business, and delivering digital change. We're also going to have a breakout session where we can share some experiences and we'll have some feedback from that. But I'm joined today by three colleagues, Ross Le Carpentier, Bill Mitchell, and Ross McWare, and they will introduce themselves as they talk through their sessions. But without further ado, let me introduce you to Ross Le Carpentier, who will talk us through our first section.
Many thanks, Sarah, and that's great. And I think, as a way of brief introduction, I'm a projects and change director at BDO. I've been at BDO for about 3.5 years, but I've got a fair few grey hairs of working in professional services previously and in industry, both managing change projects, and that's technology implementation projects, process improvements projects, transactions, etc., business strategy work as well, both in industry and in professional services, as I mentioned. So hence why I'm here. And I suppose a key thing for me here is to bring across and impart some of the thoughts that I've gained over the years, and also my colleagues in particular as we go through this session. Some elements I'm sure you will be familiar with, but hopefully as we go through there'll be ideas and thoughts that will come out that you'll be able to take away and utilise. So more than ever, I think the last 12 to 18 months has been challenging for many organisations, and embracing that change is something that so many of us have had to do, and I think in the charity sector as much as any in many respects. The many drivers for this, I think we probably all, when it all hit that sort of a year ago, adapting and getting our workforce to build and become more agile and embrace remote working was an incredible step up that we managed to achieve. And actually that how we work remotely and geographically is an ongoing challenge that we need to focus on. I think managing cost and building that resilience into our business models is also a fundamental thing that we've all had to look at. And clearly growing income and getting confidence over where that revenue and that income is going to come from to become more resilient has also been a key element. And I think there's an element around engaging and retaining and managing our people really well is particularly important as we start to come out, fingers crossed, in the next 6 months, 12 months, as we start to come out of the pandemic challenges. Opportunities for our people are going to increase, and it's really important that we make sure that we are motivating our people correctly. We're positioning ourselves really well to retain the best and to attract the best people into our organisations. And that's all about building that right long-term model. And I think sustainable, achievable long-term change is where we need to start to get to. We've gone through that react phase. We're going through resilience at the moment and making sure that we're then realising the opportunities that are ahead of us is a key element here in terms of the change that we now need to see. One element we also see is partnering and working with others, whether that's across the supply chain or with other organisations, like-minded organisations. How we work effectively with others to present a value proposition to our customers or to our members is going to be key. And Bill will come on shortly in terms of digital, but embracing that digital challenge and embedding digital in the way that we do business will be, again, another key element that we need to address and embrace. Interestingly, I think that response to the pandemic, that 12 months ago, shows really how well an awful lot of organisations did deal with that remote working challenge. The fact that so many managed to get the workforce working from home and utilising technology like Zoom and Microsoft Teams shows that with focus and with that direction, actually we can do these changes and we can do them very well. And ultimately, there's many organisations that have had to address that survival point. So making sure that change in that respect is managed and controlled carefully is clearly essential. So there's been many positives over the last 12, 18 months in terms of how change has been delivered, but this is also under a backdrop where change is particularly challenging to deliver. You've got, I built up over time sort of stats that I've just picked out from various different sites and publications, and I've just picked a few here, which I find it quite interesting. There's one survey where 73% of respondents admit that their projects are either or always doomed right from the start. It is an incredibly high percentage, I think. And I think it comes back to making sure that the projects are the right projects for your organisation, that they're set up correctly, and that the business case and the value proposition for the project is right at the outset. Only 26, 1/4 of all projects actually succeed in what they're trying to achieve, which is a stat that says all you need to know about the importance of putting in better and improved controls over delivering projects. And the final stat there, which I was just going to touch on, 42% of organisations report having a strong alignment of projects to organisational strategy, which I think is great. And all projects should have a purpose and should be aligned to your strategic outcomes. The reason why I put that stat there is the fact that if I flip that round and say, does that therefore mean that 58% of organisations don't have that alignment between projects and strategy? I think it is an interesting and telling point of the importance when projects are set up that they're done so in the right way and with that alignment. So why do these stats exist, and why is change so challenging? Well, there are recurring themes, and we'll pick up these themes as we go through these sessions. But I've just picked three broad elements here just to walk through. Well, change is complex. And I think that over the years and the decades when I've been involved, that complexity continues to increase. Many more things to think about. And just certainly in the last sort of 5-10 years, the importance of data, information security has become another variable that must be considered pretty well with most projects, because data is at the heart of an awful lot, whether it's a process improvement project, a technology project, or a wider organizational transaction type project. So there's multiple variables that need to be understood and managed. And also, let's not forget that change does include people, and people at all levels. And that involves making sure that we are engaging those people and we're getting them bought into the change that we're trying to achieve. And there is no one-size-fits-all approach here for change. Projects and the project approach for your organisation needs to be right for you and for the project that you are doing. It's not a matter of just lifting and shifting a previous project somewhere else and saying that's going to work. It needs to fit your culture. Interestingly, there's a strategy project that I'm working for a not-for-profit organisation at the moment. We're helping them develop a strategy moving forward. And the ideas and where they want to take their organisation are there. It's absolutely valid, and they make good sense, and we're helping develop that with them. But the challenge is translating those ideas and getting that buy-in at that senior management level and that director level, so that there's a clear value and there's a compelling case for change, which is so fundamental to complex change projects. That all then gives us, if we get that case for change, clarity at the outset. The business outcomes, and they need to be smart, or I put in brackets there, ish, actually, so smartish objectives. Interestingly, in the years that I've reviewed projects, I'm amazed at how few projects have good and well-defined objectives and detailed scope. I don't see smart objectives all the time, but I'd like to see smartish objectives. So I think making sure that when projects are set up, they do have good objectives with business outcomes is a really important point. It seems obvious, but I often don't see it. And getting that senior management or senior leadership type buy-in and ownership is fundamental. And so projects are complex. We need to make sure there's clarity at the outset, and then we also then need to make sure they execute effectively. And establishing the right approach and the right plans is key. Getting those smartish objectives put in place, getting the scope defined, and then putting the foundations of the approach to projects that you're going to follow for that project in place and getting it working, getting the governance right, getting the leadership type right, and then making sure we're tracking and monitoring progress effectively. Is that plan to the right level of detail? Are we delivering improvements as we go through regularly? And are we focused on those end business goals? So one of the approaches that we adopt from a BDO perspective, and is part of our kind of a rethink framework that we have, is based on just a 7 Ps, a model that we have. And these 7 Ps are internally based factors that need to be optimized and realized. And they help to answer that question, how do we realize the value of change? And by focusing on these things, that can help us. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail about these 7 Ps, just briefly, if we just look at people there, it's all about the who. How do we protect? How do we retain and motivate our workforce? Who do we want to be involved in our change initiative? Who needs to be hooked in? Some people are more leaders and drivers, and other people just need to be informed and communicated with. How do we make sure our people are engaged? And of course, our people then need to follow processes. It's all about what. What are they doing? And do we need to reframe the business process? How do we align the business structures to work with the business processes that we need to put in place? Are our operations right? How we do transactions, are they right as well? So we need to think and look at the processes in detail. And of course, why? The purpose of why an organization, what they do, why they do it is key. It's a really interesting question, I find, when we go out and we ask, why do you exist? Why is your team? What is the value of your team? And getting people to answer that question is really interesting. So that why question is always something I'll look to ask. And then on the other side here, we've got performance at the top. So how? What are those business objectives? How are we going to measure? What are the KPIs we need to put in place in order to make sure that we are monitoring and measuring our performance? And that feeds into productivity, which is all about the results. So we're monitoring our performance to see the results and making sure that we've got the systems, the operations that give us what we need in order to be able to deliver sustainable and long-term change. And we touched earlier about place, and in particular, rethinking the importance of geography and where people are going to work from. Some people have to work in certain locations, and I think we're all aware of that, but actually there's flexibility elsewhere that we need to consider. And then the final P there, profit, or more importantly, it's about returns on investment and having an appropriate financial strategy that delivers back on what your organization needs, sound and resilient. Okay. And so that's just a brief sort of model, really, just to give a sense as to some of the thoughts, an approach that we often follow as we're talking to organisations and working with them to understand the change and how it can add value. I'm going to pass across now to my colleague, Ross McWhirr, who will introduce himself, and he's going to talk a little bit more around about building resilience. Ross.
Thanks, Ross, and good morning, everyone. I'm Ross McWhirr, and I'm a manager in BDO's corporate advisory services team. What we focus on is supporting clients with performance and operational improvement and optimization. Although our services are sector agnostic, our work tends to revolve around a number of key sectors, not-for-profit and charities being one of them. What I'd like to speak through today is a little bit on trends we're seeing in the charity sector concerning change, particularly with a focus on an organisation's cost base and operating model. I then just want to touch on a recent project we've undertaken with a leading charity this year, which involved looking at their cost base and our experiences in supporting them implement that major change programme. So in terms of trends and conversations we've been having with a lot of our clients, by far the most common topic we've been discussing is this idea of resilience, and particularly how to embed resilience within an organisation's operating model. I think COVID's undoubtedly been that black swan event that's caused major disruption and challenge. But as we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and as Ross said, fingers crossed, I think many organisations, us included actually, have started to reflect on how it can also provide an opportunity to assess and change. So a key area of assessment we've seen in organisations is them really challenging the objectives they're trying to achieve and what implications this has on their operations. What we often tend to find is that charities have grown over an extended period of time, and that it's not uncommon for their operating models to have been developed with slightly less structure than other sectors, as they've either added services or merged operations. I think what this can do is create an operating model that hasn't been challenged for a number of years, and as such possibly isn't as effective or efficient as it could or should be. The first step in really considering whether this applies is taking a step back and assessing the what question of an organisation is really trying to achieve. And what this does is possibly raise a question on whether there's been significant creep over recent years as charities have grown, and whether that's caused it to expand activities potentially beyond core competencies and capabilities. If that's the case, it's probably likely that significant costs may have been added to the structure, but that this may not have necessarily translated into incremental added value. Our second trend is organisations challenging their operations more generally. And I think COVID has, in a very short space of time, as we've all talked about and Ross touched on just there, changed the way we work, where we work, and how we interact with one another. I think what this does is clearly create new ways of working and new ways of operating, and every organisation is considering and rethinking and redefining their operating model post-COVID. I think with this becomes a major opportunity. You know, how can organisations use COVID as a platform to develop a reimagined operating model, occupancy strategy, and almost this concept that we're calling the office of the future. The final two trends are somewhat interrelated. I think naturally, as incomes dropped over the last 12 months for most organisations, leadership teams have increasingly been focusing on their cost base. And when managing their cost base, I think there's a tendency to place emphasis on direct versus indirect costs. And whilst this is inevitably important, I think analysis on where costs are truly adding value is also critical. So as funding falls or becomes less predictable, it's valuable to assess the cost base against what's really driving value, what cost levers can be pulled, and ultimately how this is affecting frontline services. And I think crucially here, metrics which capture return on funds invested to drive performance management are essential. And finally, be measured but bold. This is a bit management speaky, But I think what we're trying to get across here is that in our experience, it's common to find that many charities have possibly spent a number of years responding to funding difficulties by reducing costs and salami slicing operations to calibrate their models to each budget year deficit. More recently, though, I think COVID led to a greater need for organisations to make longer lasting change and longer lasting recalibrations to address issues at source. While there's been enormous difficulties for almost everyone, I think it's also provided an opportunity for charities and all sectors really to make bolder decisions and more material changes through a more fundamental review of their target operating model. I think whilst this can take longer and potentially be more disruptive, the benefits to longer term resilience can be substantial. I'd just like to talk now a little bit about a recent project our team were involved with, how we approached it, and some brief lessons learned. This particular project was supporting a large UK-based charity to address a significant funding deficit they were facing. The exam question wasn't really one of simple cost cutting. It was more one of redefining the way in which the charity's back office operated. And this was largely due to a belief from the leadership team that their central structure was possibly not as efficient as it could be, and that there existed a number of opportunities to reduce costs, but crucially, without impacting the delivery of services. What I've put up on screen are a set of approach steps, and I just want to focus in on a couple of those. Firstly, the definition of an operational and financial baseline. This is information that I think most organisations usually think they have readily available, but what we often find is that it's more difficult and more time consuming to produce than it possibly should be. The financial baseline is typically an annual budget by function or department, but importantly that this is split out between people related costs and third party costs. This becomes really important when analysing costs and value drivers, because naturally both elements are very different. The operational baseline is then a listing which contains an organisation's roles by department, which ideally includes the spans and layers of that department. For example, how many management, team leader and transactional level heads there are. These two schedules are really the starting point of pretty much all the analysis we looked at. And that's why when talking on webinars like this, I always ask attendees to really challenge themselves on whether they either have this information to hand already, whether they already look at that kind of information, or if not, could it be compiled in less than a few days, say. The second area I want to briefly touch on is the hypothesis development stage. So our team generally adopts a hypothesis-based approach to nearly all of these assignments. And that's largely because it really helps define at an early stage the potential opportunities and a straw man to take aim at. I think it can be really easy to focus on trying to gather too much granular data early on before really taking a higher level view of where potential opportunities really lie. Defining a set of hypotheses first and almost socializing them between the leadership team and management team can often create a much more focused exercise. And on this particular project, from a total central cost base of around 20 million, we identified, I think, 2 to 4 million pounds worth of cost saving initiatives that could be implemented over the following 18 to 24 months. We recently finished a follow-on phase of work that involves setting up a program for overseeing that particular transformation program. So what I've pulled up here is really 3 key lessons that help deliver that particular project for the client. And I think the first one of those is setting up a robust PMO to manage and track the change. I think there's always a temptation, or there's always a balance really between having meetings for meeting's sake and running a program where everyone's informed and communication is cascading correctly. When an organisation is smaller or hasn't undertaken a major transformation programme before, I think that the temptation may be to run the change as a series of smaller projects rather than a fully joined up programme. What this tends to do is create subgroups where interdependencies can't necessarily be tracked. Everyone isn't informed on progress, and it becomes really difficult for the left hand to be moving with the right hand. The second tip I've got here is developing plans collaboratively and, where possible, with employees. A key part of every major change program is the development of the detailed implementation plans. And that is the kind of plans that list the 40 or 50 discrete actions to implement the project. What we find is that if these plans aren't written by those responsible for implementing the change, there can sometimes be difficulties in gaining buy-in. And I think it's fairly natural that if the implementation team haven't been part of building the plans, they may not take full ownership over them, and that this can ultimately act as a blocker to activity. And the third one there is fairly self-explanatory, but I think it really helps get the program up and running. Naturally, change projects, or the change projects to prioritize, are those that have a maximum potential benefit and are easier to implement, and characterizing these as quick win or characterizing these as quick win projects and moving quickly to implement often really helps build confidence in the program, and really get buy-in from those involved. I think at that point, I'll hand you over to Bill, who's going to be talking about digital change.
Thank you very much, Ross, and good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Mitchell. I'm a director at BDO Digital Risk and Advisory Services, and I've been involved with advising or assuring through internal audit services digital projects for an awful long time, and internal audit for an even longer time. What I'm going to talk about today is really kind of my experience, my personal experience through various assignments that I've carried out, really on some of the key steps, some hints and tips I've learned through the years about good practice and so on, and also some of the pitfalls. So moving on firstly to key steps. This is just sort of highlighting some of the key things I think are important, and it's not including everything one should have in such a digital program. But the first thing I think really important of all is ensure there is alignment to the organization's mission, vision, and values, and there's clarity about what that is and how that interlaces with a digital transformation program. A way of doing this, I think, that works really well is using and identifying the well-formed outcomes of the program. Well-formed outcomes is a term that's used in neuro-linguistic programming. It's often used in application for personal development, but there are also really good crossovers to delivering a project for an organization. I'm going to highlight a few points there. It's really finding out what do you want to do and absolutely why you want to do it. Importantly, what will it look like when it's finished? What it will feel like, and how we know we have got there. So linking in with the first Ross's SMART or SMARTish objectives. A strategy needs to be a strategy, and there are certain components. So it needs to be sequenced and bite-sized. We can't do everything at once. But one thing I wanted to really sort of bring out is the last bullet on that first column there. The outcome has to be compelling in terms of just simply clear, but also compelling, something that really engages and excites people and thinking this is actually the way forward. That really has to be a core part of it. And another element of well-formed outcomes is what's in NLP terms is called ecology. And in this context, it's really understanding from different stakeholders that are being affected by this change, particularly digital change, how that aligns to the mission particularly and the values of the organization. What is it going to be like given the values that you are trying to aspire to, what this will look like and feel like for all those that are affected by it. Moving on then to the second area of sort of key lessons. Having an iterative process of a digital strategy is really very important here. I can give you an example of a large visitor attraction that's mainly London-based that went through a digital transformation a few years ago. And I think that's probably the best example I've ever seen before and since. And the way they approach this is simply an iterative process. So what that means is they identified what they wanted to do as an organization and how they wanted to take that forward. Then they also then considered at a high level what actually digital could do to actually deliver that. Now, in actual fact, what happened was there was more that digital could do than the strategy originally, and first draft of the strategy originally anticipated. So what that meant is that digital actually informed the actual final first stage of the strategy. That would be very much linking to what the organization's there to do, its mission, values, and so on. That then developed a series, if you like, user epics describing the main things that either stakeholders of the organization will actually be using these tools for. That was approved at board level. And then the next iteration was developing the more detailed user stories, or particularly, if you like, user journeys that individual key users will be using. And then that again was approved. So you have this iterative process where you don't have just starting with strategy and then digital strategy and the two things rolling alongside each other. They actually are part of the same continuum. The key things are that also, as I've hinted at and said throughout, there's a formal approval at each of those stages. There is also another key feature around clear benefits realization. And fundamentally, absolutely fundamentally, solid and inclusive audience research. And what I mean by audience, that is in the context of any charity, that is its customers, its members, its beneficiaries. It could be local authority, government, other stakeholders, partners, and of course, staff, management, and trustees. So really thorough understanding of the audience. Moving on now to some hints and tips. Part of that audience engagement is, and understanding research, is you need to take time and invest time and money in that. It's not just, of course, only at the start of deciding what your strategy is. It's actually ensuring you spend the time and you build in resource that you bring your audience, as I call it, with you through the whole of the strategy. Second hint. It is okay, not great, but it is okay to change mid-course, but you have to have a good reason to do it. And there may be reasons external to the organization, or there may be just simply a realization that perhaps partway through that things were not quite right. It is possible to do that. Really important to take innovation and risk. And I think also what's also important to bear in mind that as part of any digital strategy, any digital change or transformation, there is not only a change in technology or in adoption of technology or ways of working, ways of engaging with your beneficiaries, stakeholders, and so on, but there's a fundamental cultural shift that has to come through. So any digital transformational strategy has to include a significant component of investment of time and effort and thinking around the cultural shift. And this relates back to this ecology point that I mentioned in the well-formed outcomes. What you will also find, and we've seen with some of our client digital projects as well, is that, let's say, for example, a core element is the reconstruction of the website to make it perhaps more interactive, putting it on, say, a Sitecore platform as opposed to perhaps older technology, etc. Part of that, it does involve engaging with parts of the organization and stakeholders that might be using the IT outside. It involved with developing the new tools or developing the content for the website. It's really important as part of that to ensure that the project techniques that you're applying are fully extended throughout, and people are aware and know how to use that. So that moves neatly onto some of the pitfalls. From an internal auditor's perspective, you might think the first point is not something you'd hear from an internal audit very often. But one of the key things I've noticed is that sometimes organizations are actually rather under ambitious about what they're trying to do. Recently, I did a review for a government archiving organization where actually the main conclusion was they were really only doing things, making changes digitally, because that was the range of expertise they had within the organization. And we knew from doing other work in other places that what could become as digital transformation could be much broader than that. So it's important to think about that. Another thing that we noticed in another review, also done fairly recently with another organization, was actually not defining what digital means and making sure, therefore, or being clear about what is actually in scope. It may well be just the website, but invariably it isn't. But you do need to define what that is. Otherwise, it can get very confusing. Taking people with you is a really good part of that, a really important part of that. And part of that will involve also ensuring you have the right skills. You need to give everyone training on the techniques that you're using, the agile project techniques. You need to brief your audiences on the purpose and use evidence-based rationale for the changes you're making. One project where it was mixing a new digital team with teams around the organization building content, there was a real cultural clash and real lack of recognition. In this case, the move was for the organization contributors to the website to rearrange their content in terms of it being user-centered. There was a lot of resistance in this particular organization to that change because they'd always done their user content, their website content in a very linear fashion. The evidence that's persuaded them that actually a user-centered approach to presenting content was the right way was simply by demonstrating the actual web hits and where people dropped off in terms of usage and what pages were looked at most and what were not looked at all. And that sort of empirical evidence really helped to persuade those that actually what the digital team, using their fancy words of agile and so on, actually really has some substance to it. The other point, and we talked about agile project methodology, and I won't go into details of what that means, and most of you I think will be familiar at least with the term. But there are different methods, and it's really important that you decide on the method you're going to use and stick to it. I've seen occasions where there has been confusion because the language is slightly different or the meaning of what the different functions and different steps is slightly different between the methodologies. Finally, I think the most important thing of all to kind of bring to a close, of course, a strategy isn't just for Christmas, it is for life. And a digital strategy doesn't stop at the end of the first bite-sized transformation. You need to maintain the skills that have been developed in the organization and retain those that maybe that you brought in to maintain the complex website, but also in terms of how to work and collaborate together, to capitalize and bank the cultural change that will happen that you've invested time in to perpetuate that. You do have to accept, though, that it is okay to not use all the bells and whistles relating to that technology that you might have adopted. So, for example, the Sitecore website tool, for example, is a tool which actually has a huge number of features that could take an organization's interaction with external stakeholders and internal stakeholders to a degree, particularly around personalization of content. But you don't have to do everything all at once. So it's important to think about in bite-sized chunks. That concludes the, if you like, the presentation part of our seminar today. Now, Ross will now introduce the breakout session.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bill. And some really interesting observations, I think, on digital and some of those challenges that need to be embraced when adopting a digital program. I think in particular, I was just going to pick up on that agile versus traditional approach and making sure that approach is understood. And agile is not just an IT type approach these days. It's much more extensive than that. And I think understanding that specific approach for your individual project is so important, getting that balance between agile and traditional. Okay. So very importantly in these kind of sessions, I always think, is having a discussion and being able to share ideas and thoughts amongst ourselves in terms of what's important. So we've planned in now 10 minutes just to break out into groups and just talk through any particular experiences that you have around delivering successful change. There may be a specific topic that you would like to talk about, but we've also proposed 3 questions that you can talk through or use as a basis. You may want to make a note of one or more of these, but the kind of 3 things, or the kind of things we were thinking about were, what are the top 3 challenges faced when undertaking change? Second question was, what has worked well and not so well in change projects that you have seen? And a third one there, actually, is it harder to get change going at the outset, or is it harder to keep on track once started? So there's a few topics there to talk through, but whichever is the most appealing, or if there was a specific thing you'd like to talk through and get different views on, that would be great. Chatham House rules apply, as Sarah was talking about, to these sessions, and be prepared to feedback if that's okay. If you could allocate somebody from your group that would be able to feed back, that would be great, who's comfortable with feeding back. Otherwise, we'll ask for volunteers, but otherwise I might pick on 1 or 2 groups when we come back. It's 10 minutes and we're going to break into those groups now. So it was just a quick session feedback debrief. Interestingly, we had a really good discussion around the challenge with so much change going on and trying to sort of prioritize and the challenges around that, but also how to engage groups or individuals who are less bought into change. And there are challenges, no doubt there are challenges. A couple of things we talked about was we're talking about change in a positive way. And actually, rather than saying the word change, do you start to say the word improvement? It's a minor thing, but it helps to on that positive outlook. And also thinking about that question of what's in it for me at any stage, or any group that's not engaged, what's in it for them? What is the reason for change? Will always be challenging, but that was something we had. Now, I was going to ask if there were any volunteers who wanted to feed back and give maybe a quick couple of minutes on thoughts on their discussion and any observations that they had. If you do, then please just unmute or share your video and off you go.
I'm happy to, Ross.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Yes,
I did warn them I was the gobby one.
Thank you.
So I think in terms of your point there about change being an improvement, we came at it with a question in mind, and also with a recognition that change might not be an improvement for everyone. So the question we asked ourselves question we were asked was, how do we strip out personal bias and remove personal agenda from change so that it's the right direction and actually it's affected and carried through, because the person with that original agenda moves on, leaves, and the impetus is dropped. So I think, we had a number of ways to come at this, but I think there are certain markers of control that we would expect, that it aligns with the organization's strategy, that future state makes sense for that, and that we have clear buy-in from at least the top of the organization, and a clear mandate and a very clear set direction to go in. But also that change is quite painful, and what will make it fail or make it work is the people involved. There's always going to be personal bias because it tends to come from someone's vision. But there are controls, there are ways of stopping this being derailed with pet projects.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. I think that personal bias point is incredibly important, because we all have them, and it's important to try and make sure we manage those. That you touched on a couple of things there. So senior buy-in. If you're talking about significant change, then that senior buy-in definitely needs to be there. There's a phrase I often use, which is the flip side, which is sponsor in name only. If that sponsor of that change project is not bought in and not driving it, then there's a real risk that it can be derailed very quickly, and it doesn't take people along the journey with them. And setting the context as well, Jane, I think you were alluding to. So if change is tough, and it does, it's improvement wherever you can, but there are people that are clearly going to challenge. So setting that context of why this is happening is also very important. Thank you, Jane. Do we have any other volunteers? Any other thoughts from any of the groups?
Rose, yeah, I can sort of, it's our experience rather than the thoughts from the groups. We had, I work for a large charity. We are about 5th largest now in the UK. And about 18 months ago, we had BDO, we'd invited BDO to implement a change management. What we found at that time is that we had our strategy planned, but we wanted to learn in a fairly short time how we can implement that strategy. So we brought BDO in about 18 months ago, just before the first lockdown started. And we found the exercise very, very useful. It was good for somebody from outside to come in and say, well, yes, you're great. You got your strategy. We agree with your strategy. So they didn't have to comment on our strategy, but how to implement it. We used BDO for the first 3-4 months. They put us on the right path. And then we are now implementing the change management ourselves. I think like most companies or most concerns over the last 18 or 12 months, we have all been under lockdown. So our biggest challenge has been implementing it as fast as we wanted it. And it's been a slow process, coupled with the fact that there have been working from home challenges on that side, staff having different resources with different priorities. But we are hoping, and we've done very well in spite of all this. And going forward, I think it'll be good. So it was very useful exercise. One question which I was going to ask, and perhaps I don't know if there's anybody in the panel from BDO who can cover it. The presentation has been great, excellent. But I also, apart from my day job as a company secretary for this large charity, I'm also a trustee and a treasurer of a small charity. It's a 2 million type net assets charity, very small. And the challenges which small charities, in my opinion, are facing is completely different as a result of the pandemic. And I just wanted to touch base as to what practical help BDO or your organization or other organizations are providing to smaller charities in these times where some of the smaller charities could literally be wiped out. Or both in terms of, I'm not talking about funding or any such like, but professional help in terms of changes. So it'll be interesting to know if there's anybody there who can throw any light on that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Anil. If you're okay, because we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, so I'm going to ask Sarah to have a ponder over that question, and then we can pick it up right at the end. So that'd be great. Thank you. And thank you for that thought on the strategy execution piece, because obviously you can create a strategy, which change strategy, but executing it and making sure that it's implemented effectively is often where it could become challenging. And sometimes there's a disconnect. I think I certainly see it between executives who have a view of the strategy and what's actually happening down on the ground in the operational delivery. And there's that kind of middle bit where you need to connect these two things together. And I think really important from a change point of view to connect those two things together. So I'm conscious of time, so I was going to ask for one more. If there was one more, if we've got time for one more volunteer or feedback session from the group, if anybody wants to go for it.
Ross, I'm happy to say something. It's not actually something that came up in our group. We didn't quite have time for it. It was something I was going to raise earlier when we were sort of talking about, sort of digital transformation and strategy. We were talking about agile approaches to sort of project management and change programs. I think this is quite an interesting one. I got my fingers sort of slightly burnt probably about 5 years ago when I was working for a professional services firm, and we were commissioned to do a piece of work for a client which was a quasi charity. And there'd been a big sort of push around the professional services firm I was working for at the time about agile, trying to get as many people sort of trained in it, or at least aware of it as a concept, and able to sort of use some of the basic approaches. And so there was quite a buzz around it. It was sort of fairly new to me, so I was sort of quite excited about it as a way of doing things a bit differently. So I set off with gusto. I was the project manager on this particular project, and I sort of set off with gusto about, I'm going to implement some of this stuff. And what I found was, and this, maybe is the fact it was 5 years ago, it's a little bit more mature and developed, and not quite so new now. But what I found at the time was that quite a number of people found it sort of profoundly uncomfortable. And that was both the client I was working with, but actually also some of my own colleagues. And what I found was there was some difficulties around things like, kind of moving away from sort of traditional project management approaches and trying to do things in, my interpretation of and I don't sort of profess that I got it completely right. I might have misinterpreted some of it as well. I was trying to do things in a more agile way, but I think people got a bit uncomfortable that how that translated was around there being kind of less rigor than there would be in a sort of traditional project management approach. And they were sort of saying, but don't you think this is a bit risky, or aren't we sort of moving a bit quickly? And I was sort of saying, this is agile. This is the new thing and the new approach. But it didn't land particularly well. I sort of, I learned quite a lot from that experience, I have to say.
Tom, thank you for sharing that as a thought and idea. And let me assure you that you're not on your own again. Agile was a really great challenge to a traditional linear way of trying to deliver projects. And there are challenges with it. So making sure you're clear of what the approach is to deliver the project and it works for you is the key thing. Agile brings in a whole load of new terminology and new approaches, which actually, unless you are running agile projects all the time, it's really difficult to keep up to speed with and understand how they work. So I think Bill earlier talked about epics. An epic is just a view of an element or a stream of the project. But this term epic, I find quite difficult to get my head around. And actually, back to basics. From a business perspective, what is it the business needs to happen? And can you then use some agile techniques in that project to help streamline the process? So I think it depends on the organization. If you are very familiar with agile and everyone knows about the terminology and how to do it, great, use it. But actually, if you're not, ask the right questions and challenge it. It's perfectly acceptable. Make sure you get that right approach for you. That would be my view. So conscious of time, so I'm going to move on just to the next couple of slides, and there'll be an opportunity for some questions just very shortly, but I'll keep these fairly short so we can try and hit our time. So there are some, I thought we often focus on the negatives to do with change. So I just thought I'll put a few thoughts that we've probably all experienced, but sometimes it's good just to hear them. But what are positive indicators of good change? So one of them, there's clear understanding across the organization of what the change is and why it's happening. That's not to say that there aren't sensitivities. Not everybody will be aware of the minutiae or the absolute end result, but there's that context that I think that Jane referenced when Jane was talking earlier, making sure that people understand why the change is happening. Sometimes that'll be improvements and sometimes other challenging situations. Really important to have that senior management team, senior leadership team bought in and aligned to the end business goal, which in it says what's the business goal, what's the business outcome you're trying to get to, and is that clear? Open and honest communications and discussions, both good and bad. Sometimes there's a good news culture in organisations where it's really difficult to talk about challenges or activities in a project that haven't gone quite so well. So it's a good indicator is where you can talk openly about the good and the bad. We certainly touched on this in the discussion that I was involved in earlier, but it's being done with people and not to people or at people. So I think that's really fundamental. Engage as many people as you can. If they don't want to come on the journey, then there's a different approach that needs to be taken. But certainly gather around those people who buy into the change and help them drive this change with you. Quick win deliverables and improvements as the project progresses is something that it keeps people engaged to see that those wins and those things happening. If I go back to a couple of the large scale technology projects I was involved in far too many years ago, it would be 9 months or 12 months or 18 months before the organisation saw the improvement or saw the go live of the project. It's far too long. So actually breaking things up and seeing quick wins regularly through the project is really important. And then having plans in place which people buy into, that they're realistic and they're achievable is really key. If you don't buy into the plan, then people won't believe the project. So those are all kind of indicators, positive indicators of good change. And then just finally, just 5 recurring themes that we look out for, we see when we're talking about successful projects. And at the top there, the business commitment. I mentioned earlier about making sure that it's led from the top and making sure that the business are owning this. So for example, the classic digital or technology project is that it's driven by IT. Nearly all technology projects, digital projects, are business projects which happen to have a technology element to them. So making sure that the business are owning the project is key. People, skills and expertise, taking the people with you, but also making sure that within your project, you've got the right people in place, you've got the right skills. That could be the right business change skills, it could be the right project management skills, it could be the right people in your organization to do the functional activity as well, but it's making sure those people are there. Project governance and controls. Have we set up the project correctly? Have we got those objectives and the scope clearly articulated? Have we got that balance between pragmatism and control? So project managers are there to be responsible for delivering the project. And we pay good money for project managers normally. So therefore, it's important to give them that sense of it is their project to deliver. So they have to apply their sense of good practice, but it has to be managed with the controls of project management good practice as well. So it's trying to get that balance right. And Bill alluded to this earlier on one of the slides he had, which is if you need to change and adapt because it's not working, change and adapt. Don't stick to something that isn't working. If a control isn't working for you, the risk, you're not managing risks through the project very well. Identify it and change how you're doing it. Methods and tools, where we touched on agile versus traditional just now, making sure that we understand the approach that's being followed is really important, and that everybody understands the wording, that agile terminology we talked about. If people in the business do not understand it, then it needs to be explained to them. Run the project using business language is really important. And then business change management. So important to have the right skills. How do you engage people? How do you manage stakeholders? How do you get people on side? How do you communicate effectively? How do you make sure they understand what they should be doing and what their roles are? So those are, just to summarize, I suppose, 5 key themes to always think about at any stage of a project. That could be right at the start. You can ask the question, have I got the right business commitment? Have I got the right people and skills, the right governance and control? You can ask them at the start, the medium, at the middle, or towards the end of a project. It's just a way of checking and balancing to see how you're going. Okay, so you'd be pleased that that brings us to the end of the slide. So Sarah, we've got a few minutes, I think, for Q&A, if there are any Q&A. I don't know whether anything's been submitted, but of course we've got Anil's questions from earlier as well, which we should try and respond to as well.
So let's start with Anil's question, and I'm happy to also have a call with you, Anil, as well, if that would be helpful subsequently. But I think just a kind of an immediate response is around, we've talked quite a lot about it in the session, but in a smaller charity, it's even more important to keep your people with you, keep them engaged, let them know what's going on. In terms of advice, we have got quite a lot of advice on the website, which we've badged around rethink. So it's thinking about, with lots of different questions to ask yourself and help and support in terms of how that might be achieved. I think the other thing that we've noticed with some of the smaller charities is that they've taken advantage of the pandemic, or they've used the opportunity of the pandemic to work more with other partners and other charities to gain more efficiencies and see how they could work together to kind of help with cost management or just delivery to beneficiaries as well. I'd also like to use this opportunity just to bring Jill Halford in, actually, who's our head of sector for charities. And Jill, I think you probably would want to add to that answer. But there's another question for you afterwards, so I'll keep you on.
Hi everyone, lovely to see you all, albeit virtually. We've been running these webinar programs since the start of the pandemic, and really part of that, Anil, was to try and get access to and get our advice and our thoughts to a wider range of the population. And been very cognizant that charities range in variety, and that's one of the things I really love about the sector is the diversity of what the charities do. We've tried to make our information both on the website and through this webinar program as accessible as possible. And one of the sessions that we did was really around cash flow forecasting and using kind of an integrated financial model to be able to protect you as trustees, as management, in making those key decisions that we've had to make over the last 12 months, but also going forwards as well. So one of my colleagues, Mark Sykes, has developed a tool which is very well suited to smaller charities as well as larger ones around cash flow forecasting, and that's been really well received. We do a lot of accounts prep for charities as well, which tend to be the smaller ones, and Mark and his team have been working really closely with those charities to help them on that cash flow forecasting journey, because I think what it's been very apparent as we've been going through and working as external auditors, that those cash flow forecasts have been either not there in the past or have not been in sufficient detail for the trustees and for management to be able to make the decisions that they've needed to make. So we're very happy to share that information with you, Anil, and of course anyone else that's on the call too.
Thanks,
you. Jill.
Thank you very much, Jill and Sarah. Thank you.
That's okay. Jill, another question for you. How would you best recommend change in the context of avoiding potential going concern warning flags that auditors must look for?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you won't be surprised to hear that I've been spending a lot of time looking at forecasts and assessing going concern, and continue to do so. I would say that it's not just the red flags for auditors. I think if you're waiting to that stage, I think it's too late. So I think it's red flags for trustees and for management as well. And what I would say is you will get challenged by your auditors, no matter who they are, whether it be BDO or whether it's another firm. And of course, change, as we've been talking about this morning, creates quite a lot of uncertainty. So what we've seen, where we've seen good financial management and good financial governance, is looking at those forecasts and doing a range of scenario planning. So knowing that you are going through a period of change, what could that mean to your finances? And what are those different scenarios? And actually, I think what's really important is what does it take to break the model? So I often say to my clients, what's your red line? How much cash as a minimum do you absolutely have to have before you start getting worried? And to be perfectly blunt, in some cases, before you're trading insolvently, before you can't close down the organisation in a way that meets all the liabilities. So I think that's, if you don't know that and you're a trustee, I think that's an exercise that you need to work with management to go through. And I would say getting assurance on those forecasts as well, getting an independent view, be that from internal audit, or discussions with your external auditor, to make sure that you can rely on the data that you're getting. And that's not really to question the ability or the capability of the management team. I think just sometimes things are missed, especially when you're managing something as the big change programs like we've been talking about. Just getting an independent view on those, I think, is really important. So those would be my recommendations.
Thanks, Jill. I'm really conscious of time, but Ross, there's one that maybe you could do a very quick answer to. I know we did talk about it briefly during the session, but are there any tips on filtering out personal biases and preferences of the leaders of change?
Good question. My sense this comes back to the detail that's needed in creating that value proposition of what the change is about. So biases come because of people's immediate views on what they expect, and often not because of sound reason. And actually, if I think of a technology example here, so the organizations that are implementing a new system because they saw about 2 years ago, one of the senior leadership teams saw somebody implementing it and running it at a competitor or at another, oh, that must be the system for us. And so the decision is taken to implement that system. So it's holding the line quite firm when it comes to creating the case for change, that compelling case that's needed, and doing the legwork and putting the foundations in place as to why we are doing this change and what is the benefit, what is the tangible benefit we're going to get out from this, rather than by undertaking this change project, it will set us up for success in the future. But we know we're going to get that success. We know we're going to get improvement, but they just can't. You can't put anything around it. Well, actually, it needs to be more than that. So I think to try and move away from personal bias, the important bit is to dive into the detail at the early stages before you commit to a long-term change project.
Thank you, Ross. Right, really conscious of time. We have gone 1 minute over, so I will bring it to a close. Thank you all very much for attending. We hope you've enjoyed the session. If you've got questions to follow up, we're happy to consider those after the session. And the slides, the recording and feedback will all come out to you in the next week. And we hope that you've got some really helpful hints and tips on how to move forward in delivering successful change. So thank you everyone for attending, and goodbye.